My father kept the list on the fridge. Same spot my whole childhood, held up by a magnet shaped like a pineapple that my mother had bought on a trip to Florida before I was born. The list was laminated, typed up on a manual typewriter sometime in the 70s by my grandfather, updated twice since then when new rules got added. It had yellowed inside the laminate to the color of old newspaper, but the text was still clear. 13 rules for storm season. Every house in Graydon had a version of it. Some were typed, some handwritten, some printed off computers in more recent years. The specific format didn't matter. The rules mattered. I hadn't been back to Graydon in 4 years when my father died in March. Hard, quick, the way he'd always said he wanted to go if he had a choice. I drove back in early June to settle the house, deal with the estate, figure out what to do with 40 years of accumulated life in a 4-bedroom farmhouse on the edge of storm country. The first thing I did when I got inside was look at the fridge. Old habit. Storm season ran June through August in Graydon, and I'd been trained since childhood to orient myself around the list the way sailors orient around the horizon. The pineapple magnet was still there. The laminated sheet still yellowed. I read through it the way you read something you've known so long. It stops having individual words and becomes more like a shape, something you recognize rather than pass. And then I got to the bottom. Below Rule 13, in the margin of the laminated sheet, someone had taped a strip of plain white paper, handwritten in blue pen, not yet laminated, newer than everything else on the list by decades. Rule 14. If you see someone standing in the storm who doesn't move, don't watch them. Look away and keep away from the windows. I stood in my father's kitchen for a long time reading that. I should explain the list for people who didn't grow up with it. Some of the rules are exactly what you'd expect from any emergency management pamphlet. Get to the cellar when the sirens go. Keep 3 days of water and non-perishables. Have a battery radio. Keep a flashlight by every interior door. Practical, sensible, the kind of rules that exist because someone looked at statistics and made recommendations. But some of them aren't like that. Rule 4. Don't call out to anyone you hear outside during a storm. Rule 7. If the storm stops suddenly, wait 20 minutes before opening the cellar door. Rule 9. Don't go out to check on neighbors until full daylight after a night storm. Rule 11. Don't look directly at a tornado through glass. Use the cellar window only to check if the storm has passed, and keep those checks brief. These rules don't come from emergency management. They come from the town, from specific things that happen to specific people over generations, the residue of tragedy compressed into instruction. Every one of them has a name behind it, an event, a family that learned something the hard way so that everyone else wouldn't have to. Rule 4 is the Costas. 3 generations back, a farm family caught in a bad August storm. They were in their cellar when they heard someone calling their name from outside, from the direction of the north field, a voice that sounded like family. 2 of them went up and out to answer it. The storm hadn't been particularly severe. It hadn't touched anything on their property. They were just gone. The field was empty. Nobody ever found them or found any sign of what had happened to them. The 2 who stayed in the cellar because they were too young to go up survived and grew old in Graydon and made sure everyone understood why you didn't call back. Rule 7, the 20-minute wait, comes from a family named Prue. Came out of their cellar too fast after a storm seemed to stop, went up into a lull between rotations, got caught when the second one came through. 3 of them. That rule is just physics and bad luck, the kind that accumulates into instruction. Rule 9. I don't know the origin of. My father told me once that he'd asked his father, and his father had said only that there were things that moved around at night after storms that didn't move around during daylight, and that he'd said it in a tone that closed the conversation. Growing up, these rules were as normal to me as traffic laws. You followed them because you followed them. You didn't think too hard about the specific geometry of the danger. You just did what the list said, and you came out the other side. I asked my neighbor Vess about Rule 14 the morning after I arrived. Vess had lived in the house to the east of my father's for 30 years. She'd brought food over when my mother died and when my father died, and probably would bring food over for any future death in our family, as long as she was standing. A practical woman, deliberate in the way of people who've spent their lives making careful decisions in difficult conditions. She was quiet when I asked, long enough that I thought she might not answer. She said it had been added after what happened with Brooke, a man who'd farmed land about 2 miles north of town. Said it quietly and then started talking about something else, and I let her because the way she'd said it made me understand that the full version wasn't something she wanted to give me standing in a driveway at 8 in the morning. I found out the rest in pieces over the next few days. Brooke had been in his house during a bad storm in June, about 3 weeks before I arrived. He hadn't made it to his cellar in time, so he'd sheltered in his interior hallway, the way the emergency guidelines say to do when the cellar isn't an option. Storm passed over his property without major damage. During the worst of it, he'd looked out his hallway window into the field. There was a figure standing out there. Middle of the field, in the full force of the storm, standing completely still, not struggling against the wind, not moving at all, just standing there while everything around it moved. Brooke had watched it for a long time, trying to figure out if it was a person who needed help, trying to make sense of it. By the time the storm passed, it was gone. He was fine that night, fine the next day, started seeming not fine about a week later. He told people he kept seeing it, not in storms, in his yard on clear days, at the edge of the tree line, in his peripheral vision when he was driving. Always still, always at a distance. He stopped going outside much, stopped sleeping properly. He told one person that he could feel it looking at him even when he couldn't see it, that it had a particular quality of attention that he'd learned to recognize, like a sound just below hearing that you feel in your teeth. 3 weeks after the storm, he packed his truck and left Graydon. Nobody had heard from him since. The rule had been written and put up in every house in town within a week of him leaving. Not by any official body, just by the people who'd been here long enough to know that when something new happened that fit the shape of something old, you updated the list. The storm that came in on my second week back was the worst I'd seen since childhood. I watched it build all afternoon, that familiar sequence I'd grown up reading, the pressure drop in my ears around 2. the quality of light changing by 4, that flat yellow that means the sky is doing something serious. The clouds to the southwest moving in a way that looked less like weather and more like intention. By 6, the sirens were going, and I was doing what I had been trained since childhood to do, filling the last gaps in the cellar supplies, moving the things that mattered away from windows, getting myself down the cellar stairs with my radio and my water and my light. I pulled the door shut above me and listened. My father's cellar is old, poured concrete, built into the ground at an angle with a short set of steps and a heavy door at the top. One small window at ground level on the north side, ground glass, lets in a minimal amount of light and allows for basic visibility outside. My grandfather had put it in specifically so you could check the status of the storm without opening the door. Rule 11 said to keep those checks brief. I sat with my back against the south wall and listened to the storm build. The radio gave me the general picture. Rotation confirmed. Tornado warning active for the county. Take shelter immediately. I took shelter. I sat in the familiar smell of old concrete and earth and waited for it to pass. At its worst, the sound was the sound I remembered from childhood, that massive freight train roar that gets inside your body and vibrates things that don't normally vibrate. The cellar door shuddered in its frame. The light through the small ground-level window went completely dark. I kept my eyes on my hands and breathed slowly and did what the list said. Then I looked at the window. Rule 11 said brief, and I'd intended brief, just to check to see if the rotation was directly overhead. I looked at the small rectangle of murky glass, and I saw the storm moving past it, the grey-green dark of it. And then I saw the feet. 2 feet, planted in the mud of my father's yard, maybe 4 feet from the window, not moving, side by side, evenly spaced, pointed toward the house. The storm was doing everything around them. The grass was flat from the wind. The rain was driving sideways, and those feet were just standing there the way a fence post stands, like the storm was weather and they were geography. 2 different categories of thing. I looked away. I want to be clear about how fast I did that. It was a reflex more than a decision. The same way you pull your hand back from a hot surface before your brain has fully processed the heat. The rule was in my head the way all the rules were in my head, deep and automatic. And the moment I understood what I was seeing, I turned my face away from the window and put my back to it and sat against the wall. I did not look back. The rest of the storm lasted about 40 minutes. I sat with my back to that window for every minute of it, and I want to tell you it was easy, that the rule was clear and following it was simple. But that would be a lie. There was a pull, not physical, not like a hand on my shoulder, more like a thought that kept occurring to me that wasn't quite my own. A persistent idea that I should check again, that I'd only seen feet and hadn't confirmed it was anything unusual, that it could have been a person who needed help, that not looking was the wrong choice. The thought felt reasonable every time it arrived. That was the thing. It didn't feel like a compulsion. It felt like logic, like the sensible part of my brain making a sensible argument that I was being irrational. I kept my back to the window. When the radio confirmed the rotation had moved east and the worst had passed, I started counting. 20 minutes. Rule 7. I sat in that cellar, and I counted to 1,200, and I did not look at the window, and I did not move until I was done. The yard was empty when I came up. I did a full loop of the house before I let myself think about it. Checked for damage, checked the outbuildings, did the practical things that follow a storm, and let the ordinary motion of it settle my body down. Minor damage. A section of fence down on the east side. Shingles off the barn roof. The garden destroyed. Normal storm aftermath for a bad one. I went back to the north side of the house, stood where the window would be from the outside, oriented myself to where the feet had been. The mud was soft from the rain, soft enough that my own boots left clear impressions with every step. I stood in the area where the feet had been and looked at the ground. No impressions. Not obscured, not washed out. The mud was smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had stood there. I stood there for a while looking at that unmarked mud. Then I went to see Vess. She let me in without a word and put coffee on and sat down at her kitchen table like she'd been expecting this visit. I told her what I'd seen. Just the facts of it, the feet, the stillness, the mud after. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said it had been a bad season for it, worse than any she could remember. She said her late husband had seen it twice, in 30 years, and both times had been enough to make him a religious man, and that she'd grown up hearing her mother talk about it like it was a fixed feature of the landscape, something that lived in the storms, the way other things live in fields or forests. Something old enough that nobody living knew where the rules about it had originally come from or who had learned them first. She said the rules worked. That was the important thing. She said in all the years the town had followed them, the people who followed them had been fine. That Brooke had made the mistake of watching too long before the rule existed to tell him not to, and that she was sorry that had happened to him, and that the rule was there now. I asked her what it was, what it actually was. She looked at her coffee. She said she didn't know and didn't want to know, and that, in her experience, the people who tried to find out ended up in worse shape than the people who just followed the rules and left it alone. She said her mother had called it a storm self, which wasn't an explanation so much as a description, something that existed in the same space storms existed in, something that had its own reasons for standing in a field and watching a house, and she had never spent 1 minute of her life trying to understand those reasons. She said the looking was the mechanism. Whatever it did, whatever it wanted, it worked through being watched. You watched it long enough, and it had something it needed from you, some kind of purchase, and after that, it didn't need the storm anymore. I left Graydon 2 days later. I finished the estate paperwork from a distance, hired a local service to clean out the house, listed it with an agent in town, handled everything by phone and email the way you can handle most things now, if you're willing to pay someone else to be present. I told myself I'd come back for the closing. I haven't yet. The closing keeps getting pushed back, and I keep being grateful for that. I kept the list, took a photo of it before I left, the whole thing, including the handwritten Rule 14 taped to the bottom. I look at it sometimes. That was 6 weeks ago. Everything has been normal since I got home. My own city, my own apartment, my own ordinary life that has nothing to do with storm season or storm cellars or laminated lists on refrigerators. I've slept fine. I followed the rule. I looked away fast enough. I know I did. Last week, we had a late-night thunderstorm. Nothing serious, the kind of summer storm that moves through fast and leaves the air clean. I woke up when it started and lay in bed listening to it for a while, and then got up to close the window in the living room before the sill got wet. The street below was empty the way streets are empty at 2 in the morning. Parked cars, wet pavement, the streetlight making everything orange and reflective. Normal. All of it completely normal. I reached for the window latch. Across the street, on the sidewalk in front of the building opposite mine, someone was standing, perfectly still, facing up toward my window, not moving in the rain the way a person stands in rain, hunched, uncomfortable, looking for shelter. Just standing there the way a post stands, the way something stands when weather is irrelevant to it. I pulled the curtain across without looking directly at it, stood back from the window, kept my eyes on the floor. The rule said don't watch. I didn't watch. I followed the rule the way I'd followed it in the cellar, back turned, counting time, waiting. But the rule was written for storms, written by people who'd only ever seen it in storm, who'd only ever needed to manage it in storms. It was written in a town where the context was always wind and sirens and a cellar door between you and the outside. I live on the 4th floor of a city building. There is no cellar. There is no 20-minute rule for this. No Rule 9 about daylight. No clear instruction for the moment it shows up in an ordinary city. Rain on an ordinary street, looking up at a window where I happened to be standing. I stood back from the curtain for a long time. When I finally looked, the street was empty. I don't know if I looked away fast enough that first time. I don't know if the fraction of a second I spent looking at it through the glass before I understood what I was seeing was brief enough to matter. I think it was. I'm mostly sure it was. But I've started keeping the curtains closed at night when it rains, and I'm typing up a version of the list from memory and keeping it somewhere I can find it, because the rules worked in Graydon for generations, and they're the only thing I have to work with. I just don't know yet if they work here. I don't know if it matters where you are. I'm starting to think it follows the rain.